31 years is a long time to keep a human heart. The one that rode through London in the last week of November, 1358, had spent those years sealed in a silver casket, embalmed, carted from castle to castle among the plate and the jewels of one of the richest women in England, and now it travelled on her chest, inside her coffin, placed there according to her own instructions. King Edward III had sent orders ahead of the funeral procession. Bishopsgate and Aldgate were to be swept and freshly gravelled before his mother passed through them, so that the horses would not stumble and the crowds would see nothing filthy along the route, and 40 men carried torches around the bier. The woman in the coffin was about 63, dressed, so the accounts tell us, in a mantle of red samite, a heavy silk woven with gold thread, the same mantle she had worn at her wedding half a century earlier when she was 12 years old. The heart belonged to her husband, the husband whose throne she had taken, the husband who died in a castle cell while her men held the keys. Her name was Isabella of France, daughter of one king, wife of another, mother of a third, and history has spent 700 years calling her the she-wolf. By the end of this video, you can decide for yourself whether she earned that, or whether the men who wrote her story simply needed a monster. Before we go back to the beginning, a quick hello from me. If you're new around here, welcome, glad you found us, and if you're one of the regulars, good to have you back in your usual spot. Do me one small favor tonight. Down in the comments, tell me where you're listening from, whether that's a night shift somewhere, a long drive, or just a dark room at 2 in the morning. I enjoy seeing how far these travel. And a proper thank you to everyone on the Patreon and to the YouTube members keeping this channel alive. You are the reason a video this long can exist at all. If you'd like to join them, the links to support the channel are down in the description and in the pinned comment. Right. Paris, 1295. Isabella was born somewhere in that city, probably in the royal palace on the Ile de la Cité, most likely in the year 1295, though nobody wrote the date down. Medieval clerks recorded the births of sons with great care. Daughters got remembered later, when they became useful. We can only work out her age backward from church law, since a girl had to be 7 before she could be formally betrothed, and 12 before she could be married, and we know the dates of both of those events in her life to the day. So 1295, give or take a few months. Paris at that moment was the largest city in Western Europe, somewhere around 200,000 people packed inside the walls, and her family sat at the absolute top of it, in a palace complex that ran along the river with its own chapels, gardens, and halls that visiting ambassadors described with something close to disbelief. Her father was Philip IV, called Philip the Fair, and the nickname referred strictly to his face. He was, by every surviving account, an unusually handsome man, tall, fair-haired, physically striking, and about as warm as the stone he built with. One bishop who knew him personally, a man named Bernard Saisset, said the king was neither a man nor a beast but a statue, and that he stared at people in total silence until they became frightened. Saisset paid for that observation, by the way. Philip had him arrested. This was a father who did not really speak to his children so much as position them. His court ran on ceremony, surveillance, and fear, and his counselors, lawyers mostly, men like Guillaume de Nogaret, did things on his behalf that shocked even a Europe well accustomed to royal violence. At one point, Philip's agents physically assaulted the Pope. An 86-year-old Pope, Boniface VIII, seized in his own palace at Anagni, roughed up, held for days. The old man died a few weeks later. Philip then arranged for the papacy itself to relocate to Avignon on his doorstep, under his influence. That was the household Isabella grew up in, a household where her father owned the church. Her mother was a queen in her own right. Joan I of Navarre had inherited her own kingdom and the county of Champagne as a small child, and she ruled them alongside her marriage, occasionally with real teeth. When one of her vassals rebelled, Joan raised troops and crushed him. Contemporaries described her as plump and plain, and they only bothered mentioning it because her husband was so famously good-looking, and medieval chroniclers were never above that sort of pettiness. But she was clever, she was capable, and she founded a college in Paris that survives in name to this day. Isabella barely got to know her. In April of 1305, when Isabella was around 9 or 10, Joan died suddenly. She was only in her early 30s. Almost immediately, whispers moved through the court. Some said poison, some said witchcraft had been used against her. One bishop was actually accused of having murdered the queen by sorcery and spent time imprisoned over it before the charges collapsed. A few voices, then and later, wondered quietly about Philip himself, though nothing was ever produced, and the likeliest answer is that a woman in her 30s died the way people in the 14th century so often did, quickly and without explanation. Either way, a girl of 9 lost her mother and was left in a palace run by a man made of marble. She had 3 older brothers, Louis, Philip, and Charles, and every single one of them would sit on the throne of France. All 3 would also die young, one after another, without leaving a surviving son, and the ancient royal line of the Capetians, unbroken for over 300 years, would simply stop. People at the time came to believe that family was cursed. Give it a few minutes and you'll see exactly where they thought the curse came from. Isabella's childhood, as far as the records show it, was gilded and cold. She had a nurse named Théophania de Saint-Pierre, who seems to have been the warmest fixed point in her early life, warm enough that decades later, as Queen of England, Isabella was still paying her a pension. The girl learned to love books, expensive illuminated ones, and she kept buying and collecting them until the year she died. Visitors to the French court described the youngest princess as strikingly pretty, and later English chroniclers, even ones who despised her, kept conceding the point, calling her the fairest of the fair. She was also intelligent in a way her husband never quite managed to be. She watched. She retained things. Her father's court was a masterclass in the uses of patience and the uses of cruelty, and she had a front-row seat for the single most cold-blooded operation of the age. At dawn on Friday the 13th of October 1307, royal officers across the whole of France opened sealed orders and arrested every member of the Knights Templar they could lay hands on. Thousands of men, in one coordinated sweep, taken in a single morning. The Templars were a military religious order, warrior monks, 2 centuries old, famous from the Crusades, and along the way they had become something like the bankers of Europe. Kings owed them money. Philip owed them a great deal of money. The charges drawn up against them sounded like a fever dream. Secret ceremonies where recruits spat on the cross, denied Christ, kissed each other on the mouth and the base of the spine, worshipped a severed head, and Philip's lawyers extracted confessions to all of it through methods that were perfectly legal at the time and perfectly horrifying to describe. Men had their feet coated in fat and held over fire until the flesh cooked off. One Templar later appeared before papal commissioners carrying a bag containing the blackened bones that had fallen out of his own feet during the burning. Others were hung by their wrists with weights tied to their genitals. Dozens died under questioning before any court ever saw them. In 1310, when a group of Templars found the courage to take back their confessions and defend the order, 54 of them were burned alive in a field outside Paris in a single day, as relapsed heretics, which was the neat legal trap built into the whole process. Confess and you lived in prison. Take back your confession and you burned. Isabella was around 12 years old while this machine was running, living in the palace of the man who built it. Weeks after those first arrests, she was put on the road north to marry the King of England. Whatever a modern reader wants to make of the woman she became, the woman who would one day watch her enemies butchered in public and dine while it happened, it seems fair to say she did not learn gentleness at home. She learned that power, applied without hesitation and without visible emotion, works. Her father was living proof of it, right up until the day the proof ran out. A day involving a burning old man and a curse that people swore was spoken out of the flames. First, though, the wedding, and the man waiting for her on the other side of the channel, and the other man, the one who had gotten there first. Edward of Caernarfon was 23 when Isabella married him, and on paper he was everything a French princess could be sold on. Tall, powerfully built, fair-haired like her father, physically impressive enough that chroniclers reached for words like handsome and well-proportioned without being paid to. He was the son of Edward I, the old warrior king who had hammered Wales and Scotland flat, and he had been engaged to Isabella since she was a toddler, part of a peace deal meant to stop England and France tearing strips off each other over the English lands in Gascony. The betrothal had been formalized in 1303, when she was about 7. By the time the actual wedding arrived, she had spent her entire conscious life knowing she would be Queen of England. What nobody had told her, because nobody quite had the vocabulary for it, was that her husband's heart was already fully occupied. Somewhere around the year 1300, a young Gascon squire named Piers Gaveston had been placed in Prince Edward's household, and something happened between those two that contemporaries spent the next quarter-century trying to name. One chronicler wrote that when the king's son looked at Piers, he felt such love that he tied himself to him with an unbreakable bond of affection above all mortal men. Another said their love was like that of David and Jonathan, and then added carefully that Edward's was beyond measure. Whether the relationship was physical is a question the sources circle without ever quite landing on, and historians still argue about it. What nobody argued about, then or now, was its intensity. Edward I eventually found it alarming enough that he banished Gaveston from the kingdom, and when the prince asked his dying father to give Piers a noble title, the old king reportedly grabbed his own son by the hair and tore fistfuls of it out. That's the story that circulated anyway. A few months later, the old man was dead, and the very first significant act of Edward II's reign within weeks was recalling Piers Gaveston and handing him the Earldom of Cornwall, a title normally reserved for royal blood, along with a rich royal bride. The English barons watched a Gascon knight's son vault over every one of them, and they filed it away. So that was the situation sailing toward Isabella. On the 25th of January, 1308, in the cathedral at Boulogne-sur-Mer on the French coast, the 12-year-old girl in a gown of blue and gold married the 23-year-old King of England, with her father watching and something like 8 kings and queens in attendance. An absurd concentration of European royalty in one church. Her trousseau was inventoried, and the list survives in the French archives. 3 crowns among the items: gold circlets, jeweled clasps, gowns, furs, plate, tapestries, the portable wealth of a Capetian daughter. Philip also gave his new son-in-law personal gifts, a ring, war horses, and according to one London chronicle written a couple of decades later, Edward promptly bundled up those gifts and shipped them across to Gaveston in England. That single line in that single chronicle grew, over the centuries, into the famous story that Edward gave away his child bride's own wedding jewels to his lover. The original text doesn't quite say that, and it never mentions Isabella at all. But the story stuck because it fit everything else people knew, and honestly, given what happened at the coronation a month later, you can see why nobody felt the need to check. Edward and his new queen crossed to Dover on the 7th of February. Gaveston was waiting on the shore because Edward, unbelievably, had left him as regent of England during the wedding trip, effectively putting the kingdom in his favourite's hands while he went to collect his wife. The greeting on the dock became infamous. Edward ran to Piers, embraced him, kissed him repeatedly, and the assembled nobility, including the French lords who had escorted the new queen, stood there watching the King of England hang off another man, while his 12-year-old bride waited. 2 of Isabella's uncles had come over for the coronation, Charles of Valois and Louis of Overthrows, senior princes of France, and they were about to get a much fuller demonstration. The coronation took place on the 25th of February, 1308, at Westminster Abbey, and it went wrong in ways that people talked about for years. The crowd was so enormous and so badly managed that a wall behind the high altar collapsed, and a knight named John Bakewell was crushed to death in the middle of the ceremony. The king was anointed with holy oil a few yards from a fresh corpse. Presiding over the arrangements, because Edward had put him in charge of the whole event, was Gaveston, and Piers had dressed for the occasion in silk of royal purple, sewn with pearls, while the Earls of England, men whose families had held their titles for centuries, wore the cloth of gold appropriate to their rank. Purple was for kings. Everyone in that abbey knew it, and everyone could see the Gascon glittering in it. He walked in the procession directly before the king, carrying the crown of St. Edward the Confessor, the holiest object in the English regalia, a role that belonged by every custom to the highest nobleman in the land. One chronicler wrote that he looked more like the god Mars than a mere mortal, and nobody meant it as a compliment. Another remarked that the barons were so enraged watching him that some considered killing him right there in the church. Then came the banquet, and the banquet was worse. The food arrived late and badly cooked, the organization having apparently collapsed along with the wall, but that was the least of it. Edward had tapestries hung for the feast, and they displayed the royal arms of England paired with the arms of Gaveston. Isabella's arms, the arms of France, were nowhere prominent. Her uncles sat there under wall hangings, celebrating, in effect, the marriage of Edward and Piers. And then they watched the king spend the meal on Gaveston's couch, talking to him, laughing with him, ignoring the girl in the crown beside him. Charles of Valois and Louis of Evreux got up and walked out of the coronation feast of the Queen of England, their own niece, in open disgust, and took the story straight back to Philip. Within weeks, letters were crossing the Channel. Isabella, 12 years old, wrote to her father complaining that she was the most wretched of wives, that her husband was an entire stranger to her bed, and that Gaveston controlled everything. Other reports said she had not even been granted the lands and income owed to a queen consort, that she was being kept short of money while Piers wore jewels that may or may not have been hers. Philip the Fair, a man who had destroyed a pope and was midway through destroying the Templars, now had a personal grievance against his son-in-law, and Philip's grievances tended to end with somebody on fire. How 12 worked in 1308 sits uncomfortably with a modern audience, and it should. 12 was the church's minimum age for a girl's marriage, and royal families used the minimum the way businessmen use a deadline. That said, consummation was normally delayed for very young brides, and everything in the record suggests Edward left Isabella alone in that sense for several years, which contemporaries would have considered proper. Their first child arrived in 1312, when she was around 16 or 17. In the meantime, she was a child queen in a foreign country, running a household, learning the politics, watching her husband's attention rest permanently elsewhere. Some historians have pointed out, fairly, that Edward may simply have regarded her as too young to be a companion yet, and that the real injuries came later. Maybe so, but the humiliations of 1308 were public. They involved her family's honor, and they happened at an age when they carved deep. She never spoke warmly of Gaveston in any surviving record. One monk of Westminster wrote flatly that the Queen and the Earl of Lincoln hated him. The barons hated him more, and their reasons went beyond the purple silk. Gaveston had a gift for contempt. He invented nicknames for the greatest men in England and made sure they circulated. The Earl of Warwick, a dark-complexioned, violent-tempered man, was the Black Dog of Arden. The Earl of Lincoln, elderly and heavy, was Burst Belly. The Earl of Lancaster, the king's own first cousin and the richest nobleman in the country, was the Fiddler, or in some versions the churl. At a tournament at Wallingford, Gaveston and his hand-picked knights publicly flattened a team of earls, which was legal and even admirable by tournament rules, and unbearable coming from him. He sat on the council, he controlled access to the king, patronage flowed through his hands, and men whose grandfathers had signed Magna Carta had to smile at him to get anything done. Within months of the coronation, the barons came to Parliament armed and forced Edward to exile him. Edward responded by making Gaveston Lieutenant of Ireland on his way out, turning the punishment into a promotion, and then spent every waking hour scheming to bring him home, buying off opponents one by one, until Piers was back within the year. That cycle, exile, scheme, return, would run twice more, and each turn wound the country tighter. Isabella, through these years, grew up. The records show her slowly accumulating what she was owed: lands, income, a proper household, partly because her father kept applying pressure, and partly because Edward, whatever else he was, gradually seems to have developed a genuine working affection for her. It's one of the stranger features of this whole story. The marriage that began with that grotesque coronation settled, for a stretch of years, into something functional and even warm on the surface. Edward gave her generous gifts. They travelled together. Her letters from the middle years of the reign show her calling him her very sweetheart. She, in turn, learned to work around Gaveston rather than against him, at least openly, because she was a teenager alone in a foreign court, and open war with the king's favourite was a losing move. Underneath, though, her position depended entirely on producing an heir and on the favourite's eventual removal, and she was intelligent enough to know both things. By 1311, the barons had forced on Edward a set of reform ordinances that amounted to a leash for a king, and Clause 20 demanded Gaveston's permanent exile as a public enemy. He went in November. By January 1312 he was back again, because Edward simply could not function without him, and this time the king declared the exile itself unlawful and restored all his lands. That was the move that convinced the earls that no legal process would ever hold this man, and once powerful armed men reach that particular conclusion, the ending writes itself. The Archbishop of Canterbury excommunicated Gaveston. 5 earls, led by Lancaster and including Warwick, the Black Dog himself, mobilized private armies under the polite fiction of holding tournaments. And in the spring of 1312, they went hunting. What happened next involved Isabella directly and not gently. She was 17 and she was pregnant. In the early months of 1312, Edward, Gaveston and the pregnant Queen were in the north of England at Newcastle when Lancaster's forces came up on them faster than expected. What followed tells you everything about Edward's priorities in a crisis. The king and Gaveston fled by boat down the river to Tynemouth, and then onward to Scarborough, moving quickly, and Isabella was left behind at Tynemouth Priory to fend for herself. 17 years old, carrying the heir to the throne, abandoned on the coast while her husband ran with his favourite. Lancaster, to his credit, sent word to her that no harm would come to her or her household, since his quarrel was with Piers alone. Her baggage was captured anyway. Some accounts have her weeping as the king departed. She made her own way south, and it seems safe to say the memory went into storage beside the coronation. Gaveston holed up in Scarborough Castle while Edward went to raise troops, and when the siege closed in, Piers negotiated a surrender to the Earl of Pembroke on remarkably civilized terms. Pembroke swore a solemn oath on holy relics to keep him safe until Parliament could decide his fate, and pledged his own lands as security. Pembroke was an honourable man, and that was the problem, because honourable men make predictable jailers. Moving his prisoner south in June, Pembroke stopped for the night at the village of Dedington in Oxfordshire and went off to visit his wife nearby, leaving Gaveston lightly guarded at the rectory. At dawn on the 10th of June, the Earl of Warwick arrived with an armed force, surrounded the house, and shouted for the traitor to come out. The black dog had come to collect. Gaveston, the story goes, was forced out barefoot and stripped of his belt of knighthood, made to walk through the streets like a thief while the crowd jeered, and then tied to a mule and paraded to Warwick Castle, where he was thrown into a dungeon. Pembroke, humiliated, appealed to everyone he could find, including the University of Oxford, pointing out that his sacred oath was being shredded. Nobody moved. The earls had their man, and they were not letting the law anywhere near him. At Warwick, before Lancaster, Warwick, Hereford, and Arundel, a name that gets its own scaffold 14 years further along in this story, Gaveston was subjected to something dressed up as a trial. He was not permitted to speak in his own defence. 2 royal justices happened to be in the neighbourhood and pronounced him guilty under the ordinances, and death was the sentence. Then came a small, grim courtesy. Gaveston was married to the king's niece, and out of respect for her royal blood, the earls decided he would be spared hanging, the thief's death, and given the sword instead. On the 19th of June, 1312, he was taken out of Warwick's lands, because the black dog was too careful to have it happen on his own ground, and marched a couple of miles to a hill called Blacklow on Lancaster's territory. Lancaster took formal responsibility, and then declined to watch. Gaveston was handed over to 2 Welsh soldiers. One drove a sword through his body. The other took his head off. The earls rode away and left the corpse where it dropped, on the grass, in the June morning. Even the disposal became a dark little farce. Since Gaveston had died excommunicate, no one could bury him in consecrated ground, and for a while no one would touch him at all. 4 shoemakers eventually found the body, carried it on a ladder, and were told by Warwick to get it off his land. The head had to be sewn back onto the trunk before the corpse could be embalmed. A group of Dominican friars, the order Edward favoured, finally took custody, and the king kept his beloved's embalmed body above ground at their house in Oxford for more than 2 years, dressed in cloth of gold, unable to bury him, apparently unable to let him go, until the excommunication was lifted and Gaveston was finally laid in the earth at King's Langley in 1315, at a funeral where the king wept openly. Edward's reaction to the killing itself was recorded by a chronicler who was probably in a position to know. On hearing the news, the king said, in effect, "By God, what a fool Piers was. I told him never to fall into Warwick's hands." Grief came out of him sideways at first, as anger at the dead man's carelessness, and then it settled into something colder and much more durable. He wanted Lancaster and Warwick dead. He wanted it for a decade. He would eventually get half of what he wanted, and the manner of it, up at Pontefract in 1322, belongs a little later in this story. For now, England teetered on the edge of civil war, pulled back mostly because Gaveston's killers had divided the opposition, moderate men like Pembroke swinging to the king's side out of sheer disgust at the broken oath. And into this poisonous autumn, Isabella delivered her trump card. On the 13th of November, 1312, at Windsor, she gave birth to a healthy son, the future Edward III. The country celebrated for a week. Whatever else the Queen was in the eyes of the English court, she was now the mother of the heir, and her stock rose accordingly. Her relationship with Edward, freed from Gaveston's gravitational pull, entered its best years. The king granted her lands and revenues on a proper royal scale. They wrote to each other affectionately when apart. 3 more children followed over the next decade, John in 1316, Eleanor in 1318, Joan in 1321. If the story had stopped around 1313, Isabella of France would be a footnote, a queen who had a rough start and came through it. Instead, in the spring of 1313, she and Edward sailed to Paris for a long ceremonial visit. Feasts, knighting ceremonies for her 3 brothers, weeks of pageantry, and at some point during those festivities, or on a subsequent visit, Isabella noticed something small. She had given gifts to her sisters-in-law, the wives of her brothers, embroidered purses, beautiful little objects, the sort of thing a queen distributes to family. Some months later, back among the French court, she saw 2 of those purses again. They were hanging from the belts of 2 young knights. The knights were brothers, Gautier and Philippe d'Aunay, Norman gentlemen serving in the households of the French royal family. The purse's owners were supposed to be Margaret of Burgundy, wife of Isabella's eldest brother Louis, heir to the throne, and Blanche of Burgundy, wife of her youngest brother Charles. A purse is a trivial thing to re-gift, and an innocent explanation was available. Isabella did not go looking for the innocent explanation. She went to her father, and Philip the Fair, the statue, the man who had turned surveillance into an art form, quietly set watchers on his own daughters-in-law. What the watchers found ended lives. Margaret and Blanche had been meeting the d'Aunay brothers for some time, and the meeting place, according to the accounts that grew up around the affair, was an old defensive tower on the Seine called the Tour de Nesle, standing across the river from the palace. Gautier was involved with Blanche, Philippe with Margaret. The 3rd sister-in-law, Joan of Burgundy, wife of the middle brother, was accused of knowing about it all and covering for them. In the spring of 1314, Philip struck, arrests all around, and the d'Aunay brothers went to the torturers. Under the methods available to the French crown, methods Isabella's family had already perfected on the Templars, both men confessed to adultery with the princesses. Adultery with the wife of a royal heir was not a private sin. It was treason against the blood of France, lèse majesté, an attack on the certainty of the succession itself, and the punishment was designed to advertise exactly that. On the 19th of April, 1314, in the town of Pontoise, the d'Aunay brothers were executed in public, and the descriptions that come down to us are difficult even by 14th century standards. The 2 men were broken on the wheel first, their arms and legs shattered with iron bars while they were tied down, alive and conscious. Accounts speak of them being flayed, the skin stripped from living bodies. Boiling sulfur and molten metal poured onto the raw flesh. Then they were castrated, and their severed genitals were thrown to the dogs in front of them while they still lived. A piece of theatre aimed precisely at the crime. Only after all of that were their heads struck off. and the broken remains were dragged through the streets and hoisted up on the great public gibbet, where the corpses hung by the armpits until weather and birds finished the work. 2 young men, probably in their 20s, guilty by any reasonable measure of nothing worse than a reckless affair, dismantled piece by piece in a market square as a lesson about the sanctity of Capetian bloodlines. The princesses fared better only by comparison. Margaret and Blanche were tried before the Paris Parlement, found guilty, and had their heads shaved in public, a ritual humiliation that stripped a noblewoman of the crowning marker of her rank. Then they were carted off to the fortress of Château Gaillard, the grim castle Richard the Lionheart had built above the Seine, and dropped into underground cells. Margaret, wife of the heir, was reportedly held in conditions of deliberate cruelty, a cell open to the wind, minimal comfort, through the winter. She lasted about a year. In August of 1315, conveniently soon after her husband became king and needed a new wife who could produce a legitimate son, Margaret died in her cell. Cold and neglect, said some. Strangled on orders, said others, and plenty of people at the time believed the second version because her death was just so very useful. Blanche stayed underground for years, and there are accounts that she bore a child in captivity, fathered by a jailer. Eventually her marriage was annulled and she was allowed to become a nun. She died young, broken by the imprisonment. Joan, the 3rd sister whose husband stood by her, was cleared and returned to court, and later became Queen of France beside him. Isabella's role in all this was noted and not forgotten. French tradition remembered her as the one who brought the purses to her father, the spark of the whole catastrophe. She may have believed she was defending the legitimacy of her family's throne, and by the standards of a Capetian, she was. But 2 men had been taken apart with iron and fire. 2 women were rotting in dungeons, and the succession of France had been poisoned by doubt, because Margaret's little daughter Joan, the heir's only child, now carried a permanent question over her parentage. That question would help unravel the entire dynasty. Within a generation, partly because no one could quite trust the bloodline anymore, France would pass to a cousin branch, and Isabella's own son would claim the French crown through her, and the 2 kingdoms would fall into a war that lasted on and off over 100 years, all of it traceable, in part, to a pair of embroidered purses a sharp-eyed queen spotted on the wrong 2 belts. And 1314 was not done with her family. A month before the Donnet brothers died screaming at Pontoise, her father had staged one final burning in Paris, and this one came with a prophecy attached. The Templar trials had ground on for 7 years by 1314, and the last act belonged to the order's Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, an old soldier somewhere around 70, who had spent those 7 years in prison being alternately tortured and paraded. In March, on a scaffold outside Notre Dame, he was supposed to confirm his confessions one final time before receiving a sentence of perpetual imprisonment. Instead, in front of the crowd, the old man raised his voice and took everything back. The order was innocent, he said. The confessions had been dragged out of him by torment, and his real crime was having lied against his brothers to save his own skin. Beside him, the preceptor of Normandy, Geoffroy de Charnay, did the same. Under the legal machinery of the Inquisition, a relapsed heretic could be handed to the fire without further trial, and Philip did not wait for the churchmen to deliberate. That same evening, the 18th of March, 1314, the two old men were rowed out to a small island in the Seine, the Île aux Juifs, within sight of the royal palace, and burned. Witnesses left descriptions. Mollet asked to be tied facing the cathedral so he could die looking at the Church of Our Lady. He asked for his hands to be left free enough to pray. The fire was built to burn slowly, from charcoal rather than a quick blaze of straw, so the process would take longer, and observers wrote that he made no sound of fear, that he told the watching officials God knew who was in the wrong, and that calamity would soon fall on those who had condemned them. Out of that scene grew the legend, embroidered over centuries, of the Grand Master's curse, Mollet summoning Pope Clement and King Philip to meet him before the judgment of God within the year. Whether those exact words were spoken on the island, nobody can prove. One Italian chronicler of the time attached a similar prophecy to a different Templar entirely. What is beyond dispute is the timetable that followed. Pope Clement V died 33 days later, and on the 29th of November, 1314, Philip the Fair, 56 years old and in apparently strong health, suffered a massive stroke of some sort while hunting and died within weeks. The statue fell inside the year, exactly as the story demanded, and Paris noticed. Then the counting started. Louis, Isabella's eldest brother, the widower of the disgraced Margaret, took the throne and was dead within 2 years, 36 years old, reportedly after drinking chilled wine while overheated from a ball game, though poison talk followed him into the grave. His posthumous baby son, John I, lived 5 days. The middle brother Philip took over, died at 42 after 6 years, leaving only daughters. The youngest, Charles, Blanche of Burgundy's humiliated husband, lasted 6 years more and died at 33, also leaving no son. Between 1314 and 1328, Isabella watched her father and all 3 of her brothers go into their tombs, and with them went 340 years of unbroken father-to-son Capetian succession. People across Europe openly called them the accursed kings. Isabella, the last of Philip the Fair's children left standing, absorbed one more lesson from her family, that no throne is safe and no bloodline protected, and she happened to be raising the one grandson of Philip the Fair who would live to press a claim. Back in England, meanwhile, her husband was busy converting his father's empire into wreckage. In June of 1314, Edward marched the largest army England had assembled in a generation up to relieve Stirling Castle, and Robert the Bruce destroyed it in 2 days at Bannockburn. English knights drowned in streams under the pushing mass of their own retreating army. Edward himself had a horse killed under him, had to be dragged from the field by his household knights, and fled so precipitously that he left behind his shield and his privy seal. The military reputation of the English crown, built over 30 years by his terrifying father, evaporated in an afternoon, and the Scots spent the following years raiding as deep as Yorkshire, burning towns while the King of England did approximately nothing about it. Isabella, who had travelled north with the campaign, got her first taste of running for the coast ahead of Scottish riders. It would not be her last. Then the sky broke. Beginning in 1315, rain fell across northern Europe through an entire summer, then the next, then much of a third. The harvests drowned in the fields. Grain prices went up 8 times over. Salt, the only way to preserve meat, became scarce because the brine pans couldn't evaporate in the endless wet. Sheep and cattle then began dying wholesale of murrain, a plague that in some regions killed 8 animals in every 10, so even the fallback of livestock collapsed. The years 1315 to 1317 are remembered as the Great Famine, and the death toll across northern Europe ran into the millions, perhaps 1 person in 10 in the worst-hit countries. English chroniclers recorded villagers eating dogs, cats and horses, then the seed grain for next year, which converts this year's hunger into next year's certainty. A chronicle from the north of England says plainly that the poor ate things not fit to be named, and several sources from these years report cannibalism, bodies stolen from gibbets for food, parents and children eyeing each other in ways no one wanted to write down clearly. In prisons, incoming inmates were reportedly set upon and eaten by the starving men already inside. Whether every such report is literal truth or the hysteria of terrified writers, the fact that the reports exist at all tells you what those years felt like from the inside. The royal family did not starve, obviously, but even they felt the machine seize up. When Edward and Isabella stopped at St. Albans in the summer of 1315, the town could barely find bread for the royal household. Bread for the king. Bodies of the poor were found in ditches around the towns, and an English public already convinced God disliked their king took the famine as confirmation. A monarch was supposed to bring victory and plenty. This one had delivered Bannockburn and biblical rain. Isabella spent these years doing the parts of queenship Edward was bad at, interceding for petitioners, patching quarrels, playing the gracious face of a regime that had little else going for it, and by the late 13-teens, she was probably at the peak of whatever genuine partnership the marriage ever contained. Her children were arriving safely. Her income was substantial. A chronicler could have described her, around 1318, as one of the more successful queens England had ever imported. Her actual job in those middle years had its own toolkit, and she had grown skilled with it. An English queen's formal power ran through intercession. A petitioner in trouble got word to the queen chose her moment and knelt before her husband. The king raised her up and granted the mercy, and everyone present understood the scene was half theatre, a mechanism that let a king change his mind without losing face. The pardon rolls of these years carry a steady traffic of forgiveness issued at Queen Isabella's request, debts respited, a hanging commuted here and there, and behind each dry entry sits a family somewhere in England that kept its father because a Frenchwoman in her 20s timed a request well. When the feud between Edward and his cousin Lancaster edged toward open war in 1318, she was among the mediators who patched together the settlement that pulled the 2 men back from it, and one account has her on her knees before her husband in public, begging him toward peace for the good of the realm. The performance may have been choreographed down to the tears. It worked, and contemporaries counted her among the most effective peacemakers in the kingdom, an odd, early line in the file of a woman posterity remembers as a wolf. Day to day, she ran a small, traveling nation. Her household numbered somewhere around 180 people, knights, clerks, chaplains, cooks, grooms, laundresses, damsels, all of it in near constant motion between residences, with carts and sumpter horses hauling her chapel plate, her wardrobe, her documents, and her actual bed from castle to castle. She hunted, kept greyhounds, flew falcons, and spent seriously on books, illuminated romances of King Arthur alongside works of devotion, a library she kept adding to for the rest of her life. Her accounts show gifts going out constantly, jewels and hunting birds mostly, the small currency by which a queen maintained a web of friendships that might someday be called on. Given where this story goes, it will not shock you to learn that when the day finally came to raise a rebellion, a remarkable number of important men turned out to owe Isabella of France a favor. She was also, by the standards of her class, sincerely religious, with a particular attachment to the Franciscan order that lasted to her deathbed, steady alms to the poor Clares, and a lifelong habit of pilgrimage, the road to Becket's shrine at Canterbury drawing her back across the decades almost like a commute. The Franciscan attachment runs quietly under the rest of this story and surfaces at the very end of it in a coffin. Danger kept brushing past her even in the calm stretch. On the Paris visit of 1313, the pavilion where she and Edward were sleeping caught fire in the night, and Edward grabbed his wife and carried her out through the flames, the two of them barely clothed, an episode that briefly makes the marriage look almost heroic. Isabella's arm was badly burned, and the injury reportedly troubled her for months afterward, scarring earned in her own bedchamber. 8 years on from that, she delivered her youngest child, Joan, in the Tower of London, and the fortress had been allowed to decay so badly that rain came through the roof of her lying-in chamber and dripped onto the childbed, water falling on a Queen of England while she laboured. She had the Tower's constable dismissed over it. Small entries like these show how she kept score, quietly and in writing. Her husband, through these same years, pursued the pastimes that made his nobles despair of him. Edward liked digging ditches. He thatched roofs, shod horses, rowed boats, swam, once reportedly in the river in February, and sought out the company of carpenters, bargemen and ditchers with the same warmth other kings reserved for earls. Chroniclers listed the hobbies as symptoms, proof of a nature unfit for a crown, a king of England standing thigh-deep in a trench while the Scots burned his northern counties. A modern eye might see a man who would have been perfectly content born into any life except the one he got. Isabella left no recorded opinion of the ditch digging. Her silence on the subject might be the most eloquent sentence in the whole marriage. Right at the peak of those workable years, the second favourite arrived, and the second favourite made Gaveston look like a harmless flirt. Hugh Despenser the younger came from solid baronial stock, his father a loyal royal servant, and he had been placed in the king's orbit for years without Edward taking much notice of him. That changed around 1318, when Hugh became royal chamberlain, the officer who controlled physical access to the king, every petitioner, every document, every whispered conversation passing through his hands. Where Gaveston had wanted glamour, jewels, nicknames, the best seat at the tournament, Despenser wanted power in its rawest forms, land and money, and he pursued them with a lawyer's patience and a gangster's methods. He had married one of the three sisters who jointly inherited the vast Clare fortune, and he set about converting his wife's 1/3 share into effectively the whole thing, prying South Wales lordship by lordship out of his sisters-in-law and their husbands, using the king's favour as a crowbar. Edward, by every sign, fell for him completely. The same consuming attachment he had fixed on Piers, now fixed on a man immeasurably more dangerous. One chronicler of the period called Despenser the King of England's right eye, and another wrote that he was like a second king, and that the older Despenser and his son ruled the realm while Edward watched. A few samples of Hugh's working methods. When the Welsh Lord Llywelyn Bren rose in revolt in 1316 and then surrendered on a promise of mercy, negotiated by other magnates who pledged their honour on it, Despenser later took custody of him, hauled him to Cardiff, and had him hanged, drawn and quartered without any proper trial, purely to make a point about who owned South Wales now. The widow Alice de Lacy, Countess of Lincoln in her own right, one of the greatest heiresses in England, was pressured and threatened, reportedly with burning, until she signed away lands. Elizabeth Comyn, a young unmarried heiress, was simply seized and held prisoner for about a year until she agreed to hand over 2 of her castles to the Despensers. His own sister-in-law Elizabeth de Clare had her lordship of Gower conjured out of her hands through legal manipulations backed by royal power. And then the case that got quoted at his trial, the widow known as Lady Barrett. According to the charges later published against him, his agents tortured her, breaking her arms and her legs until her mind gave way and she was left insane. The lady in question was probably the widow of a rebel knight from Swansea, exactly the sort of unprotected woman his machine fed on. No independent record confirms the torture beyond the accusation itself, and some historians wonder whether it was invective heaped on a hated man at his destruction. Others point out that everything confirmable about Hugh Despenser makes the story entirely believable, and that broken widows rarely got their complaints written down. Sit with either version, neither one flatters him. Ordinary people had a word for what was happening, and it was piracy, in one case literally. During a spell of political exile in 1321, Despenser took to the Channel with a ship and robbed merchant vessels, torturing crews, seizing cargoes, a baron of England operating as a sea raider while waiting for his recall. And through all of it, Edward protected him, enriched him, could not be separated from him. The barons had killed one favourite already and discovered that killing the man does not cure the king. Now they watched the pattern rebuild itself with a far more competent parasite, and the country began sliding toward the second civil war of the reign. Isabella watched too, from closer range and with more at stake. Despenser controlled the chamber, and the chamber was where her marriage lived. Her influence with Edward, painstakingly assembled over a decade, shriveled as Hugh's grew, and unlike Gaveston, who had mostly ignored her, Despenser seems to have regarded the Queen as an obstacle to be managed, then as an enemy to be dismantled. She was about to spend 5 years learning what her own tenants had learned about how this man treated obstacles. Before that, though, came an October evening in 1321, outside the gates of a castle in Kent that legally belonged to her, when someone made the mistake of shooting at the Queen of England, and her husband found, at last, a war he was willing to fight. By 1321, the lords of the Welsh Marches had had enough of watching Despenser swallow their region, and they went to war on him the medieval way, burning and looting his estates end to end, 60-odd manors wrecked, his cattle driven off, his documents destroyed. Parliament, with armed men at its back, forced Edward to exile both Despensers, father and son, in August. Edward signed, seethed, and started planning, and the plan he settled on used his own wife as bait, though whether she knew her role in advance is one of those questions the sources smile at and decline to answer. In October, Isabella set out on what was announced as a pilgrimage to Canterbury, and her route swung, not very geographically, past Leeds Castle in Kent. Leeds was part of the Queen's own dower, lands assigned to her office, but it was currently held by Bartholomew Badlesmere, a baron who had recently jumped to the opposition. Badlesmere was away. His wife, Margaret, held the castle, and when the Queen of England arrived at the gates asking for a night's lodging, Margaret refused to open them. Refusing your queen admission to her own castle was already an astonishing act. What happened next went beyond astonishing. As Isabella's party pressed toward the gate, the garrison's archers opened fire, and 6 of the Queen's servants were shot dead in front of her. Men she travelled with, killed on the road at the door of her own property. Edward's response was everything his response to Scotland had never been. He raised a large force with unusual speed, brought siege engines, and personally directed the reduction of Leeds Castle. Whatever else Edward II lacked, and the list is long, he could be roused to genuine fury when the target was small enough and a baron's wife qualified. The castle fell at the end of October, and the king hanged the garrison's leadership on the spot. Walter Culpeper the constable and around a dozen of his men strung up in front of the walls they had defended. Lady Badlesmere, whose order had started the killing, was sent with her children to the Tower of London, the first woman we know of ever imprisoned there. Public sympathy sat entirely with the king. Shooting at a queen on pilgrimage was too much even for people who loathed the Despensers, and Edward, riding the momentum, recalled Hugh from exile, split his enemies, and rolled north to finish the civil war before it properly started. It ended in March 1322 at a bridge over the River Ure at Boroughbridge in Yorkshire, where the rebel Earls of Lancaster and Hereford, retreating north with a shrinking army, found a royal force holding the crossing. The Earl of Hereford led an attack on foot across the narrow bridge, and a Welsh spearman had concealed himself underneath it, among the timbers, waiting. As Hereford passed overhead, the man thrust his spear up between the planks, up through the Earl's body from below, into the bowels, and one account specifies the entry point with a bluntness I'll leave to your inference. A great magnate of England, cousin to kings, died screaming on the planks of a bridge from a wound in an unmentionable place, and his army watched it happen and came apart. Lancaster, trapped, surrendered the next day. Thomas of Lancaster was the richest nobleman in the kingdom, holder of 5 earldoms, grandson of one king, nephew of another, first cousin to Edward himself, and for 10 years he had been the leader of every effort to leash the crown. He was also the man who had taken responsibility for the killing of Piers Gaveston on that hill a decade before. Edward had waited 10 years, and now, at Lancaster's own castle of Pontefract, he staged something with the outward shape of a trial and none of the contents. A tribunal headed by the king and the 2 Despensers recited the charges. Lancaster was not permitted to speak a single word in his own defence exactly, and I'd guess deliberately, as Gaveston had not been permitted to speak. The sentence was the full traitor's death, drawing, hanging and beheading, commuted in a mirror of Blacklow Hill, to beheading alone out of respect for his royal blood. On the 22nd of March, 1322, Lancaster was set on a starved grey pony, no bridle, an old hat jammed on his head, and paraded to a small hill outside his own castle, while a crowd, whipped along or genuine, pelted him with snow and mud. He was made to kneel facing north, towards Scotland, an arranged insult implying he had plotted with the Scots. A clumsy executioner took 2 or 3 strokes to get his head off. The greatest nobleman in England, killed like a felon in sight of his own windows, and within a few years, in the way this century kept managing, miracles were being reported at his tomb, and pilgrims were treating the site of the execution as a shrine. Lancaster was only the headline. In the weeks after Boroughbridge, Edward and the Despensers ran the most sweeping campaign of political killing England had seen since the conquest. Somewhere around 25 knights and barons were executed, at York, at Bristol, at Gloucester, at Windsor, at Canterbury, spread deliberately across the map so that every region got its demonstration. These were not quiet beheadings. Men were drawn to the scaffold behind horses, hanged, and in a new refinement that contemporaries specifically noticed and specifically hated. The bodies were not taken down. They were tarred to slow the rot and left swinging on the gibbets at town gates and over bridges for 2 full years. Badlesmere, the absent lord of Leeds Castle, was hanged and then beheaded at Canterbury, his head spiked on the city gate through which pilgrims passed to the shrine of Thomas Becket. Wives and children of the condemned went into prison, widows lost everything, and the Despensers moved through the confiscated estates like men at a buffet. One measure of the mood, years later, a parliament formally complained about the display of the corpses, that friends and kin had been forced to watch their people decompose in public for years. Edward had discovered, late, the uses of terror, and he used it the way weak men usually do, without any sense of when to stop. For Isabella, 1322 carried a more personal lesson about her husband, delivered on the Scottish border. Edward took an army north that autumn, achieved nothing, ran out of food, and retreated with Robert the Bruce's forces hunting him so closely that the King of England was nearly captured at a place called Rivaux and had to abandon his own baggage and treasure in the scramble. Isabella, meanwhile, had been parked at Tynemouth Priory on the coast, and as the Scots swept down, she found herself effectively cut off, a Scottish force between her and any rescue. Edward did not come for her. He sent instructions, one set of which involved sending men connected to the Despensers, whom she flatly refused to trust. And then he continued south. The Queen of England organized her own escape, her small household holding the priory while a ship was arranged, and she went out by sea, through weather, in genuine danger. 2 of her ladies died in the course of that flight. One killed outright in the chaos, another, heavily pregnant, went into labor from the terror and did not survive it. Women of her own chamber, dead because her husband had left her within reach of the enemy twice in 1 decade at the same priory. She got south safely. Something in her seems to have finished changing that autumn. A French chronicler later put a line under this period, writing that the Queen was held in no more regard than a maidservant in her own palace. The paperwork of her destruction has survived, and its blandness makes it worse. In 1324, war broke out with France over Gascony, the War of Saint-Sardos, her brother Charles now on the French throne. The Despensers argued, with the logic of men who wanted her gone anyway, that the Queen was a Frenchwoman and therefore an enemy alien. On the 18th of September 1324, Edward signed the orders. All of Isabella's lands, the entire dower estate of the Queen of England, taken back into the King's hands. Her income of £4,500 a year replaced by an allowance of £1 a day, roughly an eighth of what she was owed, doled out to her like pocket money. Her household, the small country of servants and clerks, a medieval queen lived inside, was purged. Her French attendants, people she had known for years, some for her whole life, were arrested, around 30 of them shipped off or imprisoned. Her 3 younger children were removed from her keeping and placed in households controlled by the Despenser family, her daughters with Hugh's wife Eleanor, so that the people raising Isabella's children were the family of the man destroying her. And Eleanor Despenser was assigned to attend the Queen herself, a watcher in her chamber, with reports circulating that Isabella's letters now passed through Eleanor's hands, her private correspondence opened, her seal effectively supervised. One chronicler adds the detail that she was made to feel it daily, in precedence, in small ceremonial slights, the Queen of England reduced in her own court below the wife of the Chamberlain. She stopped fighting it outwardly. Through late 1324 and into 1325, Isabella went quiet, compliant, agreeable. And if you have followed her family's history this far, that quietness should raise the hair on your arms. She was Philip the Fair's daughter. She had watched the Templars go from untouchable to ash in 7 years, without her father ever raising his voice. Patience was the family art. and in the spring of 1325, the war with France handed her the one thing the Despensers could not give her and could not take back once given: a legitimate, official, sealed and documented reason to leave England. The Pope himself had suggested it. Negotiations over Gascony were deadlocked, and who better to soften the King of France than his own sister, the Queen of England? Edward hesitated. The Despensers, incredibly, seem to have supported the idea, apparently reasoning that a queen stripped of lands, money and children was a queen on a leash, that she would negotiate, come home and resume being furniture. In March 1325, Isabella sailed for France with a modest escort and her husband's blessing. Nothing she does for the following year is wasted motion. In Paris, she did exactly what she had been sent to do, and did it well. Isabella negotiated a settlement with her brother Charles over Gascony, a workable truce, terms agreed by summer. The treaty contained one requirement: that the King of England come to France in person and kneel to perform homage for his French lands, the ancient feudal ritual, one king acknowledging he held certain territories from another. And here Edward faced a genuinely unsolvable problem. If he crossed to France, he left Hugh Despenser behind, and Hugh, without the king's body physically shielding him, was a dead man within a fortnight, and both of them knew it. If he took Hugh along, the French court might well arrest or kill him on arrival, so the Despensers produced what they thought was a clever solution: send the boy instead, invest the 12-year-old heir, Prince Edward, with the French lands, and let him do the kneeling. In September 1325, the future Edward III landed in France and performed homage to his uncle Charles. And with that, his mother held the Crown Prince of England, the one irreplaceable piece on the entire board, on French soil, outside Despenser's reach, in her keeping. Whether she had engineered the whole sequence from the start or simply recognized the gift when it arrived, the effect was identical. Every summons home could now be answered with delay, and every delay was safe, because she had the heir. When Edward's letters ordering her return grew insistent, Isabella made her position public, and she did it in front of her brother's full court. Staged, formal, unforgettable. She declared that marriage was the joining of a man and a woman holding to one life together, and that someone had come between her husband and herself, someone trying to break that bond. Until this intruder was removed, she said, she would consider herself a widow, and she began dressing the part. Black clothes, a veil, the garments of mourning for a husband who was still alive. A queen in widow's weeds walking the halls of Paris, a piece of visual theatre her father would have applauded. She named Despenser as the intruder in follow-up messages and swore she went in fear of her life from him, and given his documented handling of inconvenient noblewomen, the fear needs no embroidery. English envoys reported the performance home. Edward wrote her stiff letters about wifely duty, wrote to her brother, wrote to the Pope, wrote eventually to his own son ordering him home, and none of it moved anything, because by then the situation in Paris had acquired one more element. The Queen of England had taken a lover, and everyone in Europe knew it. Roger Mortimer of Wigmore now enters the story, and the second half of it belongs to him almost as much as to her. A great baron of the Welsh marches, in his late 30s, veteran of Irish wars, capable, ruthless, and physically brave in a way that had made him famous. He had joined the rising against the Despensers, surrendered in 1322 when the rebellion collapsed, and been shipped to the Tower of London under a death sentence commuted to life imprisonment. He then did something no state prisoner of his rank had ever managed. On the night of the 1st of August, 1323, the feast of St. Peter in Chains, of all the saints' days to pick, the Tower garrison held its customary feast, and Mortimer's allies inside, chiefly a sub-lieutenant named Gerard de Alspay, made sure the wine flowed downhill into every guard who mattered, wine dosed with a sleeping draught mixed by a sympathetic apothecary. The constable of the Tower drank himself into a stupor that reportedly lasted 2 days. While the fortress snored, Mortimer broke through the wall of his cell into the kitchen, went up the great chimney to the roof, crossed the rooftops, descended the outer walls on rope ladders, crossed the Thames in a waiting boat, found horses staged along the road to the coast, and was in France before the Tower fully woke up. Edward's government hunted him with orders that he be taken alive or dead. The French court gave him shelter and, one suspects, a good story to dine out on. At some point in late 1325, the exiled escape artist and the self-declared widow found each other, and the affair that followed was conducted with an openness that shocked even the French. A queen was expected to be above reproach, not because anyone believed queens were saints, but because the legitimacy of royal children hung on it. Isabella, who had spent 18 years being publicly humiliated by her husband's attachments, now returned the favor at continental scale, appearing with Mortimer, living in what the chronicles carefully call great familiarity. Her brother Charles eventually found the scandal too expensive and withdrew his support, nudged along by outraged letters from England and the Pope. It barely slowed her. Isabella simply moved her operation to the county of Hainault in the Low Countries, where Count William had ships, money, fighting men, and a marriageable daughter. The bargain was elegant. Prince Edward would be betrothed to the Count's daughter Philippa, and the girl's dowry would be paid up front, in the form of an invasion fleet. The two teenagers, by the way, seemed to have genuinely liked each other from the first meeting, one of the very few tender things in this entire story, and their marriage would become one of the happiest royal partnerships England ever had. It was purchased as a weapon. On the 24th of September, 1326, Isabella landed on the Suffolk coast with a force of perhaps 1,500 men, mercenaries under John of Hainault, exiles and her son. The force was tiny, a rounding error against what the English crown could theoretically raise, and if Edward's kingdom had contained any residual loyalty at all, the expedition would have ended in a week with her head on a spike. What happened instead was a collapse so total that historians still pause over it. The levies summoned to resist her either failed to appear or marched over to her side. The king's own half-brothers joined her, bishops joined her, then began quietly financing her. Henry of Lancaster, brother of the beheaded Thomas, came in with the might of the Lancastrian retinues, looking for the obvious repayment. Isabella issued proclamations that she came only to destroy the Despensers, enemies of the realm, and the realm, after 5 years of confiscations, hangings, and tarred corpses at its town gates, decided it agreed. Edward stood in London offering a pardon and money for Mortimer's head, and the city laughed at him. Someone pinned a mocking reply on his own proclamation. By early October, the king had abandoned his capital and was riding west with the Despensers and a shrinking circle of loyalists toward Wales, where Hugh's lands were and where a ship might be found. London, left masterless, went into a spasm of violence that October that the chronicles describe with real fear. Mobs hunted anyone tied to the regime. On the 15th of October, they caught the biggest fish still in the city, Walter Stapledon, Bishop of Exeter, the king's treasurer, one of the most hated men in England for his role in the confiscations, including, notably, the seizure of Isabella's own estates. Stapledon tried to reach sanctuary at St. Paul's. The crowd got to him first, dragged him off his horse in Cheapside, stripped him of his armour, and hauled him to the great cross where public proclamations were made, and there, on the paving stones, they cut the Bishop of Exeter's head off with a butcher's bread knife, a blade meant for a market table, wielded by many hands, sawing rather than striking. His body was dumped naked in a ditch, then reportedly on a rubbish heap. They killed his brother alongside him and two of his officials, one of whom was torn apart by the crowd. And then, in a touch that tells you the mob knew exactly whose war they were fighting, Stapledon's severed head was packed up and sent as a gift to Queen Isabella. Her formal reaction is not recorded. Her practical reaction was to keep moving west, hunting her husband, and to note that London had declared itself hers. While the capital was butchering bishops, the two sides fought a parallel war of proclamations and prize money. Edward, before abandoning London, had publicly offered £1,000 to any man who brought him Roger Mortimer's head. Isabella's camp answered from Wallingford with an offer of £2,000 for the head of Hugh Despenser the Younger. Double the money, and the doubling itself was the message, a queen advertising to the whole kingdom that she outbid her husband on his own terms, that heads had become currency and hers bought at better rates. At Oxford, in front of her army, Adam Orleton, the Bishop of Hereford, a man the regime had persecuted for years, climbed into a pulpit and preached the invasion's guiding sermon on a verse from Genesis. "I shall put enmity between thy seed and her seed," God's words after Eden, repurposed as a declaration of war between a wife and a husband. In a later sermon, he was said to have argued that the head of the kingdom had grown sick beyond healing and needed removing. Bishops choosing verses, mobs choosing knives, all of England was doing theology that autumn. Back in London, the Tower fell to the crowd in the same convulsion that killed Stapledon. Inside it, along with the state prisoners, was Isabella's second son, John of Eltham, 10 years old, left behind in the fortress when his father rode west. The mob brought the boy out and proclaimed him Warden of London, a 10-year-old presiding, in name, over a capital actually governed by whoever held the nearest blade. The Tower's prisoners walked free into the celebrating streets. The mayor was made to swear allegiance to the Queen's cause. For weeks, the greatest city in the kingdom ran itself as an armed commune in Isabella's name, hunting dispenser clerks through the lanes, and she had the political sense to stay away and let London be terrible on her behalf, keeping her own hands visibly clean while the city did with bread knives what she would shortly do with tribunals. The scale of the panic shows best at Caerphilly, where Hugh Despenser owned one of the most formidable castles in Britain, ring within ring of walls, water defences, a private fortress built precisely for a day like this one, and stocked with a fortune in treasure and provisions. The fugitives sheltered inside it, then abandoned it, apparently concluding that no wall would outlast the hatred of an entire kingdom, and they left the treasure and the garrison behind them along with Hugh's teenage son. That garrison, credit where due, held carefully against the Queen's besiegers deep into the following year, months after their lord had been taken apart in a market square, and surrendered only on a sworn promise that the boy inside would keep his life. He kept it, one of the few Despensers who could say so. Money tells the last of the collapse better than any chronicle. The royal chamber accounts, kept faithfully by clerks who followed Edward into Wales, run right to the edge of the cliff, recording the final purchases of a reign, small payments to the dwindling handful of servants still with him, arms, masses, a few shillings for necessities, the entries thinning as the household dissolved around the king. Edward had begun the autumn ruling England. By the second week of November, his effective kingdom was a wet valley in Glamorgan, a dozen loyal men, and whatever coin was left in a chest, and his wife's riders were quartering the hills for him with a price list. The end of the chase came in Wales in mid-November, in filthy weather. Edward and Hugh Despenser, with a pathetic remnant of followers, had tried to sail from Chepstow, probably making for Ireland or Lundy Island, and contrary winds threw them back onto the coast they were fleeing. For about 10 days, the anointed King of England wandered his own realm as a fugitive, sleeping in friaries and castles with a dozen attendants, his kingdom melting behind him, while search parties funded by his wife swept the valleys. On the 16th of November, 1326, a party led by Henry of Lancaster ran the king and Despenser down in open country near Llantrisant, reportedly in the middle of a storm. Edward was taken into what everyone politely called safekeeping, escorted to Kenilworth Castle and treated, for now, with the honours due a king. Hugh Despenser the Younger was taken to a very different appointment. The 2 weeks that followed held a sequence of executions that stand out for cruelty, even in this century of cruelties, and she was present for the worst of it, watching at dinner. His father went first. Hugh Despenser the Elder, Earl of Winchester, 65 years old, had shut himself in Bristol Castle, and when the city opened its gates to the Queen at the end of October, he was pulled out and put before a tribunal of his enemies, men whose kin had been hanged in 1322, whose lands the Despensers had swallowed. In a piece of deliberate symmetry someone in the Queen's camp clearly relished, he was denied the right to speak in his own defence, exactly as Lancaster had been denied it at Pontefract, and the judges said so out loud that he would receive the same measure he had dealt. On the 27th of October, he was drawn to the common gallows at Bristol and hanged, and they hanged him in his armour, a specific extra humiliation, a knight strung up in the harness of his knighthood like a scarecrow in stolen clothes. After death, the indignities continued on schedule. His body was cut down, beheaded, the head sent off to Winchester, the town of his earldom, to be displayed, and the trunk, according to accounts, was chopped to pieces and thrown to the dogs. An Earl of England, fed to animals in a town square. His grandson watched from the castle, by the way, a small Despenser boy holding out in the keep, and the 14-year-old Prince Edward was somewhere in the Queen's entourage, learning how his mother's side of the family settled accounts. 3 weeks later, at Hereford, came the Earl of Arundel, Edmund Fitz-Alan, one of the very few great nobles who had stayed loyal to Edward to the end, and one of the 4 earls who had stood in judgment over Piers Gaveston at Warwick 14 years before. Roger Mortimer had personal business with him too, since Arundel had profited from Mortimer's confiscated lands. On the 17th of November, with barely a gesture at legal process, Arundel was condemned and taken out to die by the sword. The man given the job, according to a Welsh chronicle, was a worthless fellow with a blunt blade, and it took him 22 strokes to remove the earl's head. 22. Count that out in your mind at the pace of an exhausted amateur hacking at a man's neck, and somewhere in the middle of that count, Arundel was likely still alive. 2 of his associates died with him. Whether the blunt sword was incompetence or an arranged cruelty, nobody wrote down, and both versions had precedent that year. Then came the 24th of November, 1326, and Hereford's marketplace, and Hugh Despenser the Younger's last morning. Hugh had understood from the moment of capture exactly what was coming, because he had helped invent the template in 1322. So he tried to cheat it. From the day he was taken, he refused all food and drink, trying to starve himself to death on the road, to arrive at his execution already a corpse. He nearly managed it. By the time the party reached Hereford, after a detour when he grew too weak, he was so wasted that his captors feared he would die before the crowd got its show, and the schedule was moved up. What the crowd got then was a half-dead man, and they were determined to use every remaining minute of him. He was brought toward the city stripped of his fine clothes and dressed in rags, or by some accounts stripped bare, with a crown of stinging nettles pressed onto his head, a mock coronation for the man who had played second king. Verses from scripture against arrogance and pride were scrawled across his skin. He was tied to 4 horses and dragged through the streets of Hereford, through the filth of a medieval town in November, while trumpets brayed alongside and the crowd screamed at him, pelted him, a procession designed so that every citizen could participate in his degradation. In the marketplace, a tribunal recited a long roll of charges, his thefts, his tyrannies, the executions of 1322, the widows, the tortures, Lady Barrett's shattered limbs among the counts, his procuring of discord between the king and queen, that last one, Isabella's personal contribution to the list. Like his father, like Lancaster before them all, he was not permitted to answer. The sentence combined every death the law had, and then the arrangements exceeded it. A gallows 50 feet high had been built specially, because ordinary gallows were for ordinary traitors, and Hugh Despenser was to die visible from every point in the crowd, up against the November sky. They hauled his emaciated body up the ladder and hanged him, but only partially, only enough, choking him just to the border of death, and then cutting him down while life remained, because the sentence required him alive for the rest. He was tied down, some accounts say to a ladder, others describe a bench or table. A fire was burning beside him. The executioner then castrated him, and his genitals were thrown into the flames in front of his open eyes, the punishment aimed, contemporaries understood, at the rumors of what he and the king had been to each other. Then the knife went into his abdomen, and his belly was opened, and his entrails were drawn out of his living body, slowly, and burned in the same fire while he watched, and the chroniclers who describe this note that he was conscious for it, or conscious for much of it, a man watching his own insides carried to a fire. His heart was cut out and thrown into the flames as the organ that had conceived his treasons. Only then was his head removed. One account claims that at some point in the process he managed a huge, unearthly groan and nothing more. The body was quartered, the 4 pieces sent to be nailed up at 4 different corners of the kingdom, and the head went to London Bridge, where the city that had beheaded a bishop with a bread knife greeted its arrival with music and celebration. One more man died at Hereford that day, largely forgotten now. A member of Hugh's retinue named Simon of Reading, hanged beside his master on a lower gallows, 10 feet to Hugh's 50. His recorded offence was insulting Queen Isabella. What he actually said about her, nobody preserved. The relative heights of the 2 gallows were the sentence's way of filing him under lesser business. Isabella was there. So was Mortimer, and so, according to the chronicler Jean Froissart writing later in the century, were tables of food, because he says the Queen and her companions dined while they watched, feasting within sight of the fire and the screaming. Froissart wrote decades after the fact and enjoyed a vivid scene, so hold the detail as loosely or as tightly as you like. It has never really mattered whether the roast was literal. She had travelled to Hereford for this. She sat through it. Somewhere in the ledgers of that winter, there is even a payment connected to bringing her husband's captured possessions to her, and among the things she took back was her freedom, purchased at that fire. The girl who at 12 had watched her father's kingdom burn, Templars had, at 31, staged a burning of her own, and the parts of Hugh Despenser fed to it were chosen with a precision Philip the Fair would have recognized. Which left the problem of the king. You cannot quarter a king, and Isabella's entire invasion had been advertised as a rescue of the crown from evil counsellors, not an attack on the crown itself. Edward sat at Kenilworth, physically comfortable, politically radioactive. He was the anointed of God, and no mechanism existed in English law for getting rid of him. So through January 1327, at a parliament in London that Edward refused to attend, one was improvised. Charges were drawn up, articles declaring him incompetent to govern, controlled by others, a loser of Scotland, a destroyer of his nobles, an abandoner of his realm. Bishops preached sermons on texts like "The voice of the people is the voice of God." A delegation travelled to Kenilworth to confront the king in person, and the scene they played out there was described by men who were present. Edward, told he must resign the crown to his son or risk Parliament choosing someone entirely outside the bloodline, a naked threat aimed at Mortimer's ambitions or Lancaster's, collapsed. He wept. He had to be physically supported. By some accounts he fainted outright, and in the end he submitted, weeping, saying he grieved that his people so hated him, but he was glad at least that his son would be king. On the 25th of January, the reign officially ended. The boy was crowned Edward III on the 1st of February, 1327, 14 years old, with his mother controlling the council, and Roger Mortimer, holding no formal office at all, controlling his mother. The ex-king now became the most dangerous object in England, a living, breathing alternative government in a cell. In April, he was moved from Kenilworth, where his keeper had been too gentle, and plots to free him were already sprouting, and given over to new custodians, Thomas Berkeley, who happened to be Mortimer's son-in-law, and John Maltravers. His new address was Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire. What happened inside its walls between April and September of 1327 depends entirely on whose account you pick up. The versions sit side by side, none able to silence the others, in one of the genuine dark rooms of English history, and nobody has ever found the light switch. The official version, as recorded in the castle's own accounts, shows money spent on the prisoners' food, wine, and comforts, the paper trail of a decent captivity. The chronicler Geoffrey Le Baker, writing about 25 years later and openly presenting Edward as a holy martyr, tells a different story. In his telling, the deposed king was deliberately subjected to slow, deniable killing, moved between castles by night, kept awake, kept cold, fed foul food. In the most famous of Le Baker's details, his jailers decided to shave him by the roadside, using cold, dirty water from a ditch. And Edward, in one of the few moments where any source gives him direct speech in captivity, said that whether they liked it or not, he would have warm water for his beard, and began to weep, so that his own tears warmed the ditch water. Le Baker also says the cell at Berkeley was positioned over a pit where the rotting carcasses of animals were dumped, so that the stench rising through the floor would sicken him and kill him softly, disease doing what no one wanted to order in writing. And he says the strong, athletic Edward infuriatingly refused to die of any of it. On the night of the 21st of September 1327, according to the announcement that went out, Edward of Caernarfon died at Berkeley Castle. He was 43. The news reached his son and the court at Lincoln within days. A natural death, said the first reports, of grief or an illness, and for a few years that held. Then the stories began to move. An early chronicler, Adam Muirmouth, a well-connected man writing within about 10 years, reported that it was commonly said Edward had been suffocated. Other chronicles of the 1330s say simply that he died, or that he was killed without a method. And then, in a version of the popular Brute Chronicle written within about a decade of the death, the detail arrives that everyone listening to this has already heard somewhere, the one that has followed Edward II for 7 centuries. In that telling, his murderers came upon him sleeping, pinned him under a heavy table or door, inserted a horn into his body, and ran a copper rod, or in later versions, an iron spit, heated red in a fire, up through the horn into his bowels, burning him to death from the inside, while leaving no visible mark on the corpse, so that his body could be displayed as untouched. The brute names names, a knight called Thomas Gurney among them. 20 years further on, Le Baker takes that story and turns every dial up, adding that the ex-king's screams that night were heard beyond the castle walls, that people in Berkeley town were woken by them, knew what they were hearing, and prayed for the soul of whoever was dying in the dark up at the castle. Set against the horror of the poker story, some quieter facts. The regime needed the body seen, and it was, in a manner of speaking. Edward's corpse was embalmed quickly, watched over for weeks, and displayed at the December funeral at Gloucester, magnificent, with the first known wooden funeral effigy in English history carried on the hearse, a carved and painted Edward lying where mourners would normally view the man. Local worthies were permitted to view the actual body only superficially, at a distance, already wrapped. The knight who did the embalming was never questioned by anyone who wrote anything down. A chronicler in the north, whose father had served Edward personally, recorded the death with a line that has outlasted most of the confident versions, that the king died at Berkeley. By what manner was not known, but God knows it. And then, because this story refuses to close cleanly, the survival file. 3 years after the funeral, the Earl of Kent, Edward's own half-brother, went to the block, and we'll get there properly in a few minutes, for plotting to free Edward II from Corfe Castle in 1330, on the strength of information he found completely convincing, and he was far from alone. An archbishop was writing letters that January, stating plainly that the old king was alive and well. Decades later, in the 1870s, a French archivist cataloguing papers in Montpellier found a letter written in the 1330s by a Genoese papal official named Manuele Fieschi, addressed to Edward III. In careful Latin, Fieschi relates what he says the king's father confessed to him personally. In this account, Edward was warned at Berkeley that killers were coming, exchanged clothes with a servant, killed the gatekeeper on his way out, at which point his jailers, terrified of announcing an escape, buried the gatekeeper's body as the king, or by implication used another corpse, and displayed a dead man who was never Edward. The letter then walks him to Corfe, to Ireland, across France, to an audience with the Pope at Avignon, and finally to a hermitage in Lombardy, in northern Italy, where the sometime King of England ended his days in prayer. The letter contains details of the escape route and of Edward's habits that are strikingly hard to explain, and it contains implausibilities that critics have been listing for a century and a half. Serious historians have landed on every side of it: forgery, blackmail attempt, garbled report of an impostor, and, in a few careful modern cases, substantially true. One more document. In the royal accounts for 1338, while Edward III was in Germany, appear payments concerning a man called William the Welshman, delivered to the king at Koblenz, a man who asserted that he was the king's father. An impostor claiming to be a dead king was, in the 14th century, a man volunteering for a rope. William the Welshman was brought to Edward III, and instead of a gallows, he got weeks of maintenance at royal expense. Quietly, the costs entered in the books by clerks who had no idea they were writing a mystery. Then he disappears from the record. Make of the file what you will. The official tomb at Gloucester became a pilgrimage site within years. Miracle stories, offerings, a magnificent alabaster effigy paid for by the sun. Whoever lies under it, and someone does, the monument was built by a young king honoring a father, and it may be the only completely sincere object in this entire chapter. Back in 1327, though, the announced death solved every immediate problem Isabella and Mortimer had, and the timing rewards a close look. That July, a gang led by a Dominican friar named Thomas Dunheved, a cleric fanatically loyal to the old king, together with his brother Stephen and a crew of outlaws and desperate men, had stormed Berkeley Castle and actually gotten Edward out, the deposed King of England, briefly loose in the Gloucestershire countryside with an armed band before the net closed, and he was dragged back inside the walls. The gang was hunted through the autumn. The friar Thomas was caught and died in prison, in conditions nobody bothered to record. Stephen Dunheved slipped away and kept scheming for years. And by mid-September the government had word of a second conspiracy forming in Wales, under a lord named Rhys ap Grufford, ready to try the castle next. Within days of that intelligence arriving, Berkeley announced its prisoner had died. If you were composing a timeline of convenience, you could not improve on it. The Queen wore mourning again, this time with the paperwork in order. The heart was cut from the corpse at the embalming, sealed in a silver casket, and sent to the widow, and Isabella put it away and kept it for 31 years. That casket returns at the very end, on her own chest, in the coffin, and you now know enough to feel how strange an object it is. So how did Isabella and Mortimer actually govern, once they had the whole apparatus in their hands? The honest answer is, like the people they had overthrown, only faster. The couple who had sailed in promising to rescue England from favourites who devoured the realm settled into devouring it themselves, with an appetite that startled even their allies. Within weeks of the new reign, Isabella had assigned herself a settlement of 20,000 marks a year, well over £13,000. And to put a number that abstract into some human scale, a skilled English craftsman of the day might see £5 in a year. A knight could live handsomely on 40, and the entire ordinary revenue of the crown ran to about 30,000. One historian has called it, as far as the records show, the largest income any individual in England had ever been granted up to that point. She took roughly a third of the kingdom's income for herself, plus lands, plus the late regime's confiscated estates, plus the treasure Edward and the Despensers had hoarded, some £60,000 of it, most of which simply evaporated into her household within a couple of years. When her young son married Philippa of Hainault in 1328, the girl who had bought the invasion with her dowry, Isabella declined to hand over the dower lands that traditionally belonged to a queen consort. England had 2 queens now, and the older one kept the money. Philippa went almost 2 years without her own establishment, and observers noticed and remembered. Mortimer, for his part, collected Welsh lordships the way the Despensers had, and in 1328 he had himself created Earl of March, a brand new title, grander in its geographic sweep than any existing earldom, and began carrying himself in a manner witnesses catalogued with growing disbelief. He walked beside the young king rather than behind him. He remained seated in the royal presence while the boy stood. He staged Arthurian round table pageants at which, people muttered, he seemed to be auditioning for the role of king. His own son, allegedly, took to calling him the king of folly, and when your own household is producing that joke, the whole country has already told it. Meanwhile, his liaison with the Queen Mother continued unhidden, and in 1329 there were even persistent reports, discussed seriously by historians, that Isabella was pregnant by him in her mid-30s, while officially the widow of a murdered king. If a child was born or lost, the records keep the secret. Either way, every month the pair ruled, the young king's humiliation compounded, and Edward III was not growing up into a boy who tolerated humiliation. The regime's actual performance in the field settled the question of whether any of this could last. In the summer of 1327, the Scots came over the border raiding, and the government mounted a massive, expensive campaign to catch them, the Weardale Campaign, which turned into one of the most miserable military farces of the century. The English army blundered around the wet hills of the north for weeks, soaked, starving, unable to force battle on Scottish horsemen who moved twice as fast, and when they finally cornered them across the River Wear, the Scots declined to be attacked, and the English declined to attack. Then one night the Scottish commander, James Douglas, pulled off something almost operatic. He took a few hundred riders across the river in the dark into the sleeping English camp, cutting tent ropes and killing men in their blankets, and drove straight for the royal pavilion, whose guy ropes were slashed, collapsing the tent onto the 15-year-old King of England inside it. Edward III came within a sword's length of being killed or dragged off to Scotland as a hostage in his own camp, in his own kingdom. His chaplain died in the scramble to protect him. The Scots got away essentially untouched. The campaign dissolved, and the boy king, it was recorded, wept with frustration and shame. Tears of a 15-year-old sound like a small detail in a story this bloody. Rage with a long memory starts exactly there. Unable to fight Scotland, Isabella and Mortimer sold it. The Treaty of Northampton in 1328 recognised Robert the Bruce as king of an independent Scotland, renounced every English claim over it, and sealed the deal by marrying Isabella's younger daughter Joan, 6 years old, to Bruce's son David, 4. The English public reaction can be measured by the name they gave the agreement, the Shameful Peace, and by the fact that at the wedding celebrations at Berwick, the young King of England refused to attend, a 15-year-old's protest vote against his own mother's foreign policy. Little Joan was handed over to Scotland with the nickname Joan Makepeace attached to her, a 6-year-old exported as an apology, and her life ran long and mostly loveless. Londoners, for their part, flatly refused to let the regime return the Stone of Scone north as promised, the one clause of the humiliation the public could physically sit on. Opposition formed around Henry of Lancaster, the Earl whose support had made the invasion possible, and who now found himself frozen out of the government he had installed. His armed protest in 1328 collapsed when Mortimer moved faster and harder, burning Lancastrian lands, and the Earl, going blind, submitted and paid ruinous fines. Two of the old royal half-brothers, the Earls of Kent and Norfolk, had backed Lancaster and then scrambled back into obedience. Kent, though, Edmund of Woodstock, the late king's half-brother, a man in his late 20s described by contemporaries as amiable and not overburdened with judgment, had developed a private torment. He had signed off on the deposition of his brother, profited from it, and somewhere along the way he had begun to hear, from voices that seemed remarkably well informed, that his brother was not dead at all, that Edward of Caernarfon lived, secretly held, at Corfe Castle in Dorset. The way the regime dealt with him, more than any execution of an enemy, shows what Isabella and Mortimer had become. The information reaching Kent was, in the judgment of a number of historians, planted, a lure manufactured by Mortimer's agents, with men at Corfe playing along, lights and signals at the castle, whispers of the old king kept in comfort inside, though others think Kent stumbled onto rumours that were circulating anyway, and the Archbishop of York, William Melton, was writing in January 1330, in a letter that survives, that Edward II was alive and in good health, so the rumour mill had grand clients. Kent bit. He sent a letter into Corfe addressed to his brother the king, pledging to free him and restore him. The letter went straight to Mortimer. In March 1330, at a parliament in Winchester, the Earl of Kent, uncle of the reigning king, son of Edward I, was arrested, confronted with his own letter, and condemned to death for treason against the nephew whose crown his plotting threatened. And think the logic of the charge all the way through. He was to die for attempting to rescue a man the government officially insisted was 3 years buried. Kent grovelled. He confessed everything, named associates, offered to walk from Winchester to London barefoot with a halter around his neck like a penitent felon, begging his nephew's mercy. The young king, 17 now, may never have been given the chance to grant it, and accounts suggest Isabella pressed hard for death before mercy could interfere, urging the sentence on while her son was managed around. On the 19th of March, 1330, Kent was brought out to die outside the walls of Winchester, in his shirt, in the morning. And then he stood there, for hours. The execution stalled for the length of a working day over a problem nobody had anticipated. No one would do it. The appointed headsman had fled rather than take the head of a king's son, and nobody else in royal service would touch the axe. The whole apparatus of the state standing embarrassed around a shivering man in his shirt while the sun crossed the sky. From morning, the accounts say, until the hour of vespers, late afternoon, early evening. A prince of England waited out his own botched killing, wondering hour by hour whether the delay meant mercy. Eventually, the government found its volunteer in the prisons, a convicted latrine cleaner, a gong farmer under sentence of death himself, who was promised his own life in exchange for taking Kent's. As deals go, both sides kept it. One squalid stroke of borrowed courage, and the son of Edward I was dead in the dirt, beheaded by a man pulled out of a cell that morning, while the Earl's wife, heavily pregnant, went into close confinement with her children and gave birth in captivity within the month. The kingdom absorbed the news with a shudder that even the regime's friends registered. If the king's own uncle could be entrapped, condemned in a managed parliament, and butchered by a latrine cleaner while the crown's officers studied their shoes, then no one in England stood on solid ground, and every magnate quietly did the same calculation. The young king did a version of that calculation too, with additional variables. His uncle was dead, judicially murdered in his name and against, quite possibly, his will. His mother and her lover had killed a member of his own close family and demonstrated they could do it whenever they pleased. His wife Philippa was crowned at last in 1330, pregnant at 17, and in June she gave birth to a son, an heir, at which point Edward III had something new and clarifying to protect. And Mortimer's spies were inside the king's own household. His correspondence watched, his friends questioned, so that in October 1330, when the court gathered at Nottingham for a council, the 17-year-old King of England was, in every sense except the ceremonial one, a prisoner of his mother's regime, and both sides had begun to understand that this ended with somebody dead. Nottingham Castle sat on a great sandstone rock above the town, and Isabella, who by 1330 had developed a healthy sense of how coups happen, took precautions there that tell you she felt one coming. She had the castle gates locked each night, and, in a detail multiple accounts preserve, she took the keys into her own keeping, sleeping with them so that no door in that fortress could open without her knowing. Guards were doubled. Mortimer, meanwhile, had spent the preceding days interrogating the young king's closest friends, William Montague among them, demanding to know whether a conspiracy existed against him. Montague looked the most powerful man in England in the eye, denied everything, and afterwards went to the king with the sentence that survives in the chronicles and probably decided the whole thing, that it was better to eat the dog than let the dog eat them. Edward III agreed. He was 17 years old, and he was about to run the most surgically efficient coup in English history against his own mother. The castle had a weakness its owners had forgotten, and its caretaker had not. William Eland, a local official who had known the place for years, revealed to the plotters that a passage ran up through the sandstone itself, a tunnel from the base of the rock into the castle interior, unwatched, unlocked, because the Queen's keys controlled doors, and this route did not pass through any of them. On the night of the 19th of October, 1330, Montague and a couple of dozen armed men followed Eland into the dark under the castle, up through the wet stone, and came out inside the walls, where the young king, who had remained ostentatiously visible inside the castle all evening, joined them. They moved straight for the royal apartments. In an antechamber near the Queen Mother's rooms, they hit resistance, swords in the dark, and 2 of Mortimer's men were cut down, his steward Hugh Turplington among them, killed with a mace by one of the king's companions. The noise reached the room where Mortimer was in conference, by most accounts with the Chancellor and a couple of allies, and the Earl of March went for his own sword and managed nothing with it. They took him alive, on the king's explicit instruction, because Edward III wanted a trial, wanted the whole performance, wanted it legal in exactly the way none of the regime's own killings had been. Isabella was close by, and the moment that has attached itself to her ever since happened in those minutes. Hearing the struggle, understanding instantly what it meant, she cried out to the darkness beyond her door, to the sun she assumed was out there, and the words the chronicler gives her are these: "Fair sun, have pity on gentle Mortimer. Fair sun, have pity on gentle Mortimer." Whether she said exactly that, or anything, the line has outlived everyone in the castle, partly for the sheer strangeness of the adjective. Gentle Mortimer, the man who had entrapped and beheaded her brother-in-law, hanged his rivals, and grown fat on a kingdom's confiscations. She was pleading for the one person in her life she seems to have actually chosen. Her marriage had been arranged at 3, her queenship imposed at 12, her rebellion forced by degradation, but Mortimer she had picked, freely, catastrophically. And now his boots were dragging past her door, and her son was not answering her. Edward III did not repeat his mother's mistakes, and one of her mistakes had been theatrical cruelty. Mortimer got none of the Hereford treatment. He was taken to the Tower, the same fortress he had once escaped through a kitchen chimney, and held until a parliament assembled in late November. His trial was, in its way, a mirror held up to everything he had done. He was brought in bound and gagged, unable to speak in his own defence, precisely as Lancaster had been silenced, and the elder Despenser, and the younger, and Kent, the whole procession of the voiceless condemned now arriving at its architect. 14 charges were recited, seizing royal power, procuring the death of Edward II at Berkeley. That charge stated plainly in open parliament, entrapping and murdering the Earl of Kent, embezzling the treasury, and the peers condemned him without deliberation worth the name. The one mercy, and it was almost certainly a mercy aimed at Isabella rather than at him, came in the sentence: the drawing and quartering were remitted. On the 29th of November 1330, Roger Mortimer, 1st Earl of March, was dragged from the Tower to Tyburn on an ox hide. The hide a small kindness that kept the road from flaying him before the rope got its turn, and there, at the gallows tree where common thieves ended, stripped to a plain black tunic, he was hanged like a felon, the first nobleman ever executed at Tyburn, launching a tradition that would run for 4.5 centuries. The chronicles record that he confessed on the ladder that Kent had been the victim of a contrived plot, an interesting choice of final subject. His naked body was left swinging for 2 days and 2 nights on display for London before the friars were permitted to take it down. He was buried at Coventry, a long way from anywhere Isabella would ever lie, and when his widow later petitioned to move the body, the king refused. Even Mortimer's bones stayed where Edward III put them. One thread was left hanging out of the Berkeley file, the men who had actually been inside the castle in September 1327, and their fates run like a dark little epilogue that nobody ever managed to finish. Thomas Berkeley, Lord of the House, was summoned before that same November Parliament of 1330 and asked formally how he wished to acquit himself concerning the death of the king held in his keeping. His answer went into the official roll, where you can still find it today. He said he had never consented to the death nor helped it in any way, and had never even known the king was dead until he entered this present parliament. 3 years after the announcement, 3 years after the funeral at Gloucester that his own county had turned out for, with its effigy and its wrapped corpse, the owner of the castle stood before the assembled realm and stated on the record that all of this was news to him. He added that he had been away from Berkeley at the time, ill at another of his manors, and Parliament remarkably took the answer. A jury of knights cleared him of any part in the killing. The residual question of his negligence was left to drift for years, and in 1337 he was fully and finally acquitted, after which he lived out his days wealthy, honoured, and permanently attached to the strangest alibi in English history. Thomas Gurney, and William Ockley, the two men Parliament named as the actual killers, had sensibly not waited around to be tried, and were condemned to death in their absence. Rewards went out, and English agents began working the ports and courts of Europe. Gurney was recognized and arrested at Burgos in Spain in 1331, and the King of Castile agreed to hand him over. Before he could be put on a ship, he escaped and stayed loose for roughly 2 more years until agents traced him to Naples in 1333 and took him a second time. This time a trusted English knight was sent out to escort the prisoner home in person, since the government very much wanted to hear, under controlled conditions, what Thomas Gurney had to say about that September night and about who had given the orders behind it. On the voyage home, Gurney died. The official version said illness somewhere off the coast near Bayonne. The rumour that started almost at once and has never entirely stopped said he was beheaded at sea to keep his mouth from opening in front of the wrong audience and naming men or a woman greater than himself. Either way, the one witness everyone in England wanted to question arrived as a corpse. Ockley was never found at all. He rides out of the record in 1330 and simply stops existing, one of the 2 alleged killers of an English king evaporating so thoroughly that historians cannot even establish which country he died in. And John Maltravers, the co-custodian of Berkeley, was condemned that same season, though, in a distinction somebody drew very carefully, for his part in entrapping the Earl of Kent rather than for anything done to the old king. He fled to Flanders and then played the longest game of anyone in this story. He made himself useful abroad, working the Crown's interests in the Low Countries year after year, wool politics and discreet errands, letting the decades sand the edges off his name until Edward III finally permitted his return, restored his lands, and let him die in his own bed in 1364, an old man in royal favour. Line the 4 of them up: an owner who knew nothing, a killer silenced by the sea, a killer who vanished off the face of the earth, and an accomplice patiently rehabilitated, and you can see why the locked room at Berkeley has never stopped drawing people back to it. Every man who could have answered the question was handled by luck or by design in precisely the manner that kept the question open. Now the question everyone in England was asking in December 1330, what do you do with your mother? She had, at minimum, presided over a regime that had judicially murdered her brother-in-law and had been formally accused through her partner of arranging her husband's death. Other kings in other centuries solved this category of problem with a convent cell or a quiet, fatal illness. Edward III's solution was stranger and, whatever moved him, striking, he protected her completely. Isabella spent the weeks around the coup under guard at Berkhamsted, and there are hints in the record, taken seriously by some of her biographers, that she suffered a collapse of some sort in that period, a breakdown of nerves or health in the immediate wreckage of losing Mortimer, her power, and her income in a single night, with payments for physicians appearing in the accounts. Every charge, every inquiry, every whisper of proceeding against her was smothered. Official blame for the entire regime was loaded onto Mortimer's corpse, the fiction adopted and maintained for the rest of the century that the Queen Mother had been misled by an evil traitor rather than partnered with him. She surrendered the obscene 20,000 mark income and the mountain of estates. And then, within about a year, her son gave most of the ordinary wealth back, restored her dower lands in 1331, settled on her £3,000 a year, later nudged up toward 4,000, a sum that made her one of the richest individuals in the kingdom for the rest of her life. Whatever passed between mother and son in private that winter, no clerk was in the room, and the silence has been fertile ground ever since. Into that silence, centuries later, crawled the legend, probably the version through which half of you first met this woman. The story goes that Isabella, guilty and grieving, went insane, that her son locked the madwoman away in Castle Rising in Norfolk for nearly 30 years, and that on certain nights her shrieks and cackling can still be heard from the battlements, where her ghost, in some tellings a white she-wolf, still paces. Victorian writers loved this version. Agnes Strickland's hugely popular Lives of the Queens spread a genteel account of it in the 19th century, and the ghost industry has kept it in print ever since. The account books tell a different story, and the account books, unlike ghosts, survive in bulk. Isabella bought Castle Rising herself before the coup, and after 1332 she lived there and at her other residences, Hertford Castle chief among them, as a wealthy dowager queen in full command of her freedom. Her registers show minstrels on the payroll, huntsmen, grooms, falconers, dozens of squires and damsels, hounds and hawks, gifts of jewels, purchases of wine by the ton. She rebuilt parts of Castle Rising for comfort. She collected romances, books about King Arthur expensively illuminated, and religious works, the library of a serious reader. She travelled between her properties constantly, which imprisoned madwomen tend not to do, went on pilgrimages to Walsingham and Canterbury, entertained French envoys during her son's wars, and appears in the records doing something close to diplomatic consulting, the last living child of Philip the Fair being far too useful an asset to waste. Edward III visited her regularly 2 or 3 times a year, sent her gifts of falcons and wine and, one year, a wild boar. Her grandchildren visited, including the Black Prince, who seems to have been genuinely fond of his grandmother and dined with her often in her final years. If this was a prison, most of England would have volunteered for it. And still, underneath the ledgers, you can feel why the madness story found soil. A woman who had done and lost what she had done and lost, keeping Christmas in Norfolk with minstrels playing, practically begs for screams. The records supply falcon bills. Both can sit in the same castle. Time, meanwhile, took its usual payments. Her daughter Eleanor was married off to a duke across the sea. Little Joan Makepeace came home from Scotland periodically, her marriage to David Bruce childless and cold, and in the end Joan preferred her mother's household to her husband's kingdom, one more woman in this family whose grand dynastic wedding purchased her nothing. And in 1348 the world Isabella had survived everything in nearly ended altogether. The Black Death came into England that summer, and through 1349 it killed, by the most careful modern estimates, somewhere between 1/3 and half of everyone in the country. Whole villages emptied, monasteries wiped out, London burying its dead in mass trenches, the living too few to bring in the harvests of the dead. Isabella, in her 50s, sat in her castles while the mortality rolled past the walls, and it did not touch her. Her daughter-in-law lost a little daughter to it, Joan of England, dead of plague on her way to a wedding in Spain. The queen who had outlived her father, her 3 brothers, her husband, her lover, and most of her enemies, now outlived a third of her country, and you could forgive the people of Norfolk for concluding that something about the woman in Castle Rising was not entirely subject to ordinary rules. An inventory survives of some of what she kept around her in those last years, and it makes for oddly intimate evidence. Books of Arthurian romance, the Holy Grail, Sir Lancelot, the same stories she had been buying since she was a young queen, chronicles of history, devotional works, relics accumulated across half a century of pilgrimages housed in her chapel. Her accounts also show messengers running between her household and her son's court every few days, news of the French war, of births, of deaths. The old queen still sitting at the center of a web of information, and by several signs, still consulted on French affairs that nobody else in England had lived close enough to touch. And somewhere among the plate and the jewels sat the 2 objects she never explained: the red samite mantle from 1308, folded away through 50 years of moves between castles, and the silver casket from Berkeley. Servants packed that mantle and that casket and carted them from residence to residence for decades, presumably without asking questions, and she kept them close enough that when the time came, her executors knew exactly where both were and exactly what she wanted done with them. Most people destroy the evidence of the marriages that hurt them. She curated hers. Her final year is documented in unusual detail, and 1358 shows exactly what her son's England had decided she was. In April, at the great St. George's Day festivities at Windsor, celebrations that year swollen by the presence of a captive French king, since Edward III's wars in France, fought in his mother's name and blood right, had by now produced the astonishing spectacle of King John of France, living in England as a prisoner after the Battle of Poitiers. Isabella attended as the most honored woman in the realm. The accounts record what she wore: a gown of silk and silver, worked with 300 rubies, 1,800 pearls, and a circlet of gold on a woman of 63, at a party where the crown of France, the crown of her father, was represented by a hostage. She dined with the captive French king, her kinsman, more than once that year, the 2 of them presumably having the most heavily freighted dinner conversations in Europe. Her expenses show gifts, music, hawking, the machinery of a great household running at full tilt. Nothing about the year suggests a woman winding anything down. Then, in the summer, something in her body began to fail. She had made one last pilgrimage in June to Canterbury, to the shrine of Thomas Becket, riding out from Hertford as she had done all her life, and on the road she fell ill. The household accounts, precise to the end, show medicines being rushed out from London apothecaries, her physician Master Lawrence attending, and one of her biographers has raised an eyebrow at an entry from those final weeks, a large quantity of a powerful remedy administered shortly before the end, medicine of the sort you gave when nothing gentler was working. Her daughter Joan, the Queen of Scots, Joan Makepeace herself, now in her late 30s and long estranged from her husband, came to Hertford and nursed her mother through the last weeks personally, the little girl once traded away for a shameful peace turning out to be the child who held her mother's hand at the end. On the 22nd of August, 1358, at Hertford Castle, Isabella of France died. Some sources say that in her final days she took the habit of the Franciscans, the order of the Poor Clares she had patronized for years, dying dressed in the rough cloth of poverty after a lifetime of samite and rubies. Deathbed piety of exactly that theatrical completeness was fashionable among great ladies of her generation, and she was never once, in 63 years, unfashionable. The funeral took 3 months to arrange, which by itself announces how grand it was intended to be. Her body lay at Hertford, embalmed, watched around the clock, and the watching arrangements survive in the accounts. 14 poor men and women hired to stand vigil over the coffin in shifts, day and night, week after week, paid by the Crown to pray beside a dead queen through the autumn. In late November the procession set out for London. Torches, black-draped horses, and the swept and gravelled streets we started with. And on the 27th of November, she was buried, at her own request, in the choir of the Greyfriars Church at Newgate, the great Franciscan church of London, near the high altar, close to the tomb of her aunt. Her choice of Greyfriars has kept historians arguing ever since, because that church held one other notable burial. The body of Roger Mortimer had lain there briefly after Tyburn before its removal to Coventry, and some have wondered whether the old woman was choosing at the end to lie where her lover's body had rested. Others point out that Greyfriars was simply the most fashionable burial church in London for aristocratic women of her generation, and that her aunt was there, and that the Franciscans were her order. The building itself declined to preserve the answer, and we'll get to what happened to it in a moment. 2 details of the burial, both from the antiquarian records of the tomb, have carried this story for centuries, and by now you have the full context for both. She went into the coffin, the tradition holds, wrapped in the mantle of red samite from her wedding of 1308, kept for 50 years through everything you have heard tonight. The coronation banquet, Tynemouth, the confiscations, Hereford, Berkeley, Nottingham, folded away in chest after chest, in castle after castle, and brought out at the end to dress her corpse. And on her breast, per her instructions, they placed the silver casket, holding the embalmed heart of Edward II, cut from his body at Berkeley in 1327. A widow buried with her husband's heart was, in fairness, an established custom of the age. Other queens did versions of it, and if you want the gesture to be ordinary piety, the precedent exists. But no other queen did it wearing the dress from a wedding that had curdled into deposition and a locked room at Berkeley, and no other queen had been named, through her partner, in an open parliamentary charge concerning how that heart's owner came to die. Guilt, love, defiance, appearances, every explanation has been argued and not one of them can be checked. She left the 2 objects and no commentary, and honestly, as exits go, it suits everything else we know about her. The woman communicated in staged images her whole life, the widow's weeds in Paris, the rubies at Windsor, and this was the last one, composed for an audience of God and posterity is still standing in front of it, arguing. Her son built her a fine tomb of alabaster in the choir, and now the afterlife of all of it, starting with the name. Nobody in the 14th century called Isabella the she-wolf of France. Her contemporaries called her Plenty. Chroniclers of her lifetime swung between admiration of her cleverness and disgust at her greed and her adultery, one calling her a virago of iron when it suited and Jezebel when it suited better. But the wolf came much later, and it came second-hand. Around 1592, Christopher Marlowe put her on the London stage in his play about Edward II as that unnatural queen, false Isabel, fixing her for English audiences as the treacherous wife. Shakespeare, in one of his Henry VI plays, coined the actual phrase, she-wolf of France, whose tongue more poisons than the adder's tooth, and aimed it at a completely different queen, Margaret of Anjou, French wife of a later failing king. The transfer happened in 1757, when the poet Thomas Gray published an ode featuring the she-wolf of France tearing, with unrelenting fangs, the bowels of her mangled mate, and his own note spelled out that he meant Isabella and the murder of Edward II. Bowels being a word chosen with the poker story clearly in mind. It stuck instantly and permanently. The Victorians embroidered the madwoman of Castle Rising onto it. Novelists in the 20th century built whole celebrated cycles around her and her cursed family, and by then the she-wolf was simply who she was, a woman renamed 400 years after her death by a poet quoting a playwright who had been talking about someone else. Only in the last few generations have historians gone back through the ledgers and the letters and assembled the other Isabella, the 12-year-old at the coronation banquet, the woman stripped of lands, children, and household by a man she credibly feared would kill her, the political operator who executed a nearly bloodless conquest of a kingdom with 1,500 men, and then, yes, also the woman of Hereford and Winchester who watched the fires and signed off on the entrapments, because the rehabilitation only works if you keep both halves, and she would probably tell you the same. As for the church where she lay, history treated it the way history treated everyone in this story. At the Reformation, under Henry VIII, the Greyfriars community was dissolved and the church stripped, and in the years that followed the monuments inside were broken up and sold. 9 or 10 cartloads of tombs and gravestones, the records say, carted off for the value of the stone and metal, Isabella's alabaster among them. A new church on the site burned to the ground in the Great Fire of London in 1666, with whatever remained in the soil sealed beneath the rebuilding. Christopher Wren's replacement church then had its heart torn out by German bombs in December 1940 in the firestorm raids of the Blitz, and was never rebuilt. Today, the site is a rose garden and some quiet foundations off Newgate Street, office workers eating lunch above the vanished choir, And somewhere below the flower beds and the centuries of rubble, in ground that has burned twice and been sold once, lie whatever is left of a Queen of England, a red silk mantle and a small silver casket that once held a human heart, waiting there, unmarked, since a swept and gravelled morning in 1358. And that's where I'm going to leave her, down under the roses with the heart on her chest. This one was heavy, I know, so thanks for going the whole distance with me. If tonight's episode kept you company, the nicest thing you can do is tell me in the comments which figure you want on the table next. I genuinely build the schedule out of those. Huge thanks as ever to the Patreon crew and the YouTube members. You fund every hour of this, and if you fancy joining them, everything's linked in the description and the pinned comment. Get some sleep. Mind how you go. Catch you in the next one.